The threat of nuclear war is greater than ever. That's the warning from Britain's top security advisor. He blames the breakdown of communication between the West, Russia and China. So what's needed to restore global security? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. The West could accidentally stumble into a nuclear war with Russia or China. That's the warning from Britain's National Security Advisor, Stephen Lovegrove, who says communication channels between the West and its rivals have collapsed. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, he says, is the clearest example of this breakdown. Diplomacy failed to prevent the war. Moscow and Kyiv haven't held face-to-face talks since March. Lovegrove says the conflict is just the beginning of a broader contest for a successor to the post-Cold War international order. He's warning of new security risks as countries develop more advanced weapons and compete in both outer space and cyberspace. The solution? Better dialogue between the West, Russia and China.
During the Cold War, we benefited from a series of negotiations and dialogues that improved our understanding of Soviet doctrine and capabilities, and vice versa. This gave both of us a higher level of confidence that we would not miscalculate our way into nuclear war. Today, we do not have the same foundations with others who may threaten us in the future, and particularly with China. Here, the UK strongly supports President Biden's proposed talks with China as an important step. Trust and transparency built through dialogue should also mean that we can be more active in calling out non-compliance and misbehaviour when we see it.
Let's bring in our guests in London, Sahil Shah, a nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament analyst. In Santander, Spain, Fabrice, Pothier, CEO of the consultancy Rasmussen Global. And in Toulouse, France, Alexander Titov, a lecturer in modern European history at Queen's University, Belfast. A warm welcome to each of you. I want to begin in London with Sahil Shah. There is a very famous film, Dr. Strangelove, which is almost a parody, but also a warning about the way two countries can get into an accidental nuclear war. It was designed as a parody, but a lot of what was in that film, a lot of the central tenet of foreign policy is that there are back channels, and those back channels will always save us. But now we have Stephen Lovegrove, National Security Advisor to the UK, saying those back channels don't exist. Is he right?
Well, it's no secret to you or your audience, Imran, that we're in a major Russia-West crisis, and that includes the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, but it's actually much wider than that. And I think we all have to ask ourselves, what kind of Russia-West crisis do we want? Do we want a deep Cold War, or do we want how it was during the latter parts of that period where we actually communicated with the adversary and we worked together to try to muddle through despite our differing worldviews? At the moment, it is true the lack of dialogue between the US and Russia and NATO and Russia is putting us in a very precarious position because it's not just the back channel forms of communication that are necessary. We also need very, very resilient and smart front-end channel communication. So, for example, between Presidents Biden and Putin. And if we are to stumble into some sort of a nuclear conflict, I'm currently not confident, for example, that the hotline that exists between Washington and Moscow would be able to technically stand up to the challenges that would happen in a degraded environment in the middle of a nuclear war, for example. So Stephen Lovegrove's comments at CSIS in DC yesterday were very important, and it's a very, very important reminder that we need to make sure that we have the ability to communicate clearly and smartly to the adversary, because that's how we got out of the Cold War, and that's how we'll also get out of this current Russia-West crisis.
Let me bring in Fabrice Pothier here. Fabrice, this is not just about Russia. China is also a very big concern for not just Stephen Lovegrove, but communications with China generally. But we're in a position now where perhaps we don't need that kind of communication, that big red telephone. There's drones, there's satellites nowadays. We've got different types of tech. You have monitoring going on. You have other channels. Are those traditional methods of thinking kind of outdated?
Not really, but I think what is not up to date is the way we speak, including about nuclear deterrence. So I think I slightly disagree with the previous speaker. It's not the lack of dialogue, because actually it's not for the lack of having tried to engage, especially with Vladimir Putin. I mean, President Macron, NATO itself, the US administration have all tried to reach out to the Russian president. It's the lack of interest on his side to truthfully and meaningfully engage with the West and try to minimize the risks of conflict and incident. And I think fundamentally what we have to focus on our side is really what kind of language we want to speak. And on nuclear, for example, the fact that Vladimir Putin used agitated the nuclear flag very early on in his war of aggression against Ukraine, that didn't really get a response from the Western nuclear powers, was actually a confirmation that the West has lost a bit of the nuclear deterrence grammar. And we need first to relearn the grammar before engaging in a meaningful dialogue.
Let me bring in Alexander Titov here. Fabrice makes a very interesting point about learning grammar and language and history. The 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Everybody knows that the Russians put missiles into Cuba, which freaked out America because it was 90 miles away from the US mainland. What everybody forgets is actually the only reason those missiles were in Cuba is because the Americans put missiles in Turkey, which was in Russia's backyard, effectively. There's always been a disconnect between, when it comes to the language and the framing of all of this, when it comes to Russia, when it comes to China, that they're always the bad guys. Has that been unhelpful?
Well, I think kind of we move beyond good or bad guys. That's not relevant anymore. Of course, Russia is bad. Of course, China is bad. So far as the West is concerned, there's nothing to discuss at the moment. So far as those classifications are concerned. If you just go back to the initial 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, that's when the red lines were put. When the direct phone line was put between Washington and Moscow to prevent anything like this happening again. And that's really what created the kind of Cold War security architecture in terms of mutual deterrence and so forth, was this very dangerous crisis, which later led to agreements in the early 70s about limitations on arms and so forth. So I'm afraid what we're having now is this another crisis very similar to that one, where the red lines are blurred. There is some communications behind the lines. The Russian military is speaking to. There are open lines with American military and so forth. But at the same time, the red lines are very blurred. We're having a very gradual build-up of military assistance to Ukraine, the range of missiles and so forth, which previously, even 3 months ago, that would be unthinkable. So, and Russians haven't really responded to this. So we are kind of pushing towards this line where we don't know when the Russians will actually say that enough is enough, and they might kind of escalate it further on their own side. So that's what is dangerous at the moment. It's not so much lack of communications, but these blurred lines, which are very reminiscent of the 1962, when the last big nuclear crisis happened. So I think I agree with the first speaker that there are actually very, very dangerous times we're living in now.
Okay, so that's Russia, that's China, that's, and that's the US and that's the West, and there is a big red telephone, and we just need to probably use it a bit more than we are using it. But there isn't a big red telephone to North Korea, to Pakistan, to India, to Israel, and those guys have nuclear weapons, and neither of them have signed the non-proliferation treaty. Sahil, what is the danger of those states, those smaller states with nuclear weapons?
Sure. Let me make 2 quick points just to respond to my fellow panelists. The first is I totally agree with Fabrice. I think the main comment that I was trying to make is that we need resilient crisis communication channels so that if this conflict in Ukraine spirals into a wider, for example, NATO-Russia conflict, that we have the ability for our leaders, whether on the nuclear brink or already past the nuclear brink, to avert complete calamity. And my second point is that a part of deterrence is, of course, being able to communicate effectively to your adversary. And if you don't have any communication channels open and you're simply relying on rhetorical posturing in public and in the media, that's a really dangerous place to be in because it offers very little private off-ramps to be able to de-escalate the situation. And when it comes to your comment just now about there already being a red telephone and but we don't have them with the other states, this is why I'm nervous. It's because that bilateral channel between Washington and Moscow, there isn't one between Washington and Beijing at the leader level that's created in the same way. And there also are very limited military to military channels between these three great powers. Moreover, there's no way for any of the leaders of any of these countries, these three countries, and also the wider 9 countries in the world with nuclear weapons, to be able to communicate multilaterally. So there's no way right now for, say, Presidents Biden, President Putin, President Xi to get all on the phone at once, especially in a degraded environment in the middle of, say, a nuclear conflict. And we need something like that. In terms of the smaller nuclear powers or rising emerging nuclear powers, of course, it's very dangerous and they all affect the international security environment in different ways. Right now, North Korea is expanding its nuclear arsenal. Iran is becoming closer and closer to a threshold state because of the lack of agreement between the US and Iran on restoring the 2015 nuclear deal. These are all very worrying developments. And in addition to the ongoing war in Ukraine, they're going to factor in very heavily over the course of the next month as the international community convenes in New York to discuss that 52-year-old nuclear non-proliferation treaty, the NPT, which is really that cornerstone international treaty that governs the world in terms of setting the standards and also creating the pathways to global disarmament and keeping a cap on proliferation at the same time.
But Fabrice, the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, has failed in many ways because India has nuclear weapons, Pakistan has them, Israel has them, North Korea has them. But there's no real communication between India and Pakistan right now, and that is probably the closest flashpoint that we have. Fabrice, do you think there needs to be a stronger NPT, or at least, or does it need to be more better policed rather, and those countries need to sign up? We need to pressure them to sign up.
Frankly, I think the success of the NPT is that the failure has been contained to a handful of countries. And I think this is the key here to this discussion today is a lot of non-nuclear countries are watching the war in Ukraine and to see how and whether the West will be sufficiently supporting Ukraine to the extent where the Ukrainians can prevail somehow in the battlefield and in the negotiations. And if we were to fail to do so, I think a lot of countries who currently are not nuclear weapon countries will consider what is considered the ultimate guarantee, which is nuclear weapons. So I think what we do here in Ukraine, in fundamentally what is a conventional conflict, could have some very important repercussions about how the NPT is holding or not. So that's my answer to kind of connect the NPT to the geopolitical reality of today.
In Toulouse, Alexander Titov, would you agree with that?
Well, I think the point about that, I think everybody knows that the ultimate guarantee is nuclear weapons. I mean, if you look at Libya, what happened to Gaddafi when he kind of agreed to give up his weapons, and then 10 years later, he ended up in a ditch and so forth. The North Korea knows it very well, and Russia is so bold in Ukraine because it knows that NATO, certainly United States, are not prepared to risk a nuclear war over Ukraine. So we are living in the age when nuclear weapons are essentially the ultimate guarantee, which gives you superpower status. And the question of how to prevent it from spreading further is an important one. But on the trajectory that big states such as India, Pakistan, Israel, and possibly soon to be Iran as well, if they can, they will acquire it because that's basically is how the world works, unfortunately, these days. And nuclear weapons, as we see in Ukraine, gives you an extreme advantage in terms of putting pressure on this. Of course, the key point about the regional powers, if we go back a bit earlier to earlier point, is that nuclear weapons are largely kind of regional threat, whereas Russian threat is a global threat. They are the handful of the five established nuclear powers actually have capabilities to strike anywhere else in the world, which not necessarily the case with the others, but of course they're working on that. But yeah, that's the ultimate. We're already living in a world where ultimate guarantee of security is nuclear weapons, and there's no turning back, I'm afraid.
The ultimate guarantee of security, then, is nuclear weapons. We all seem to be agreed on that. It seems to be a doctrine, certainly. You mentioned Iran there. I want to talk about Iran. Iran has got very close to being a threshold state, as it's been described. It hasn't said it has a nuclear weapons program, has admitted to having a nuclear program. The JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, effectively froze all those tensions and brought Iran back into the world. But then that treaty was ripped up by President Donald Trump, and the US is finding it incredibly difficult to renegotiate that treaty. Sahil, this is a failure again of the West, of America, because certainly no one trusts that America will stick to its deal. That's the Iranian way of thinking right now. Why should we trust the US if they're just going to rip up a deal? So why not get nuclear weapons?
Well, there's a growing chorus of voices in Tehran that feel that the only way for them to have the right leverage to be able to negotiate a sustained deal that they can trust with Washington and with other world powers is to increase their status from having a very, rich nuclear program to one of a nuclear threshold state, or perhaps even getting a nuclear weapon. Unfortunately, that would be extremely risky for the entire global security architecture, because it would probably incite some sort of a military conflict in the region, particularly with Israel. So we really do need to get Washington and Tehran to agree to the roadmap that was already largely decided in March of this year, but that both sides are dragging their feet on. Washington has to make up for the fact that it was indeed the U.S. abrogation of the deal under President Trump that caused this trust deficit in the first place. Iran continued to comply with the deal for an entire year before gradually reducing its implementation. Of course, we also now had President Biden come into office and drag his feet for a number of months. And then now, as we're getting closer and closer to the U.S. midterm elections, it seems that there isn't the political willpower in the White House to get the JCPOA's restoration over the finish line. And I really call on President Biden, who in October, before he came into the White House, wrote a very compelling CNN op-ed that said there's a smarter way to be tough on Iran, which really made a clear argument for why it's so important to get the JCPOA back in place, so that we are in a position to be able to think smart about the other issues that we have within Iran. With Iran, for example, its expanding ballistic missile program.
Sorry, Sahil, we are running out of time, and I want to bring in our other guests as well. Fabrice, you've heard what Sahil has been talking about there. We do need to bring Iran back to the negotiating table. America does seem to be dragging its feet. But what is the incentive for the West to try and force the Americans back to the negotiating table? Is there any? Is there any pressure anybody can put on them?
Well, I think the incentive is also upon the Americans to avoid, as the previous speaker said, a regional conflict and possibly a regional stroke nuclear conflict. And you have to read the recent US-Israel joint declaration, which is actually very clearly where the US is giving to the state of Israel clear guarantees that it will not allow a nuclear Iran for happening. And I think that's the clearest signal today that the US is committed not to have a nuclear weapon state in the region, apart from obviously Israel, but this is not mentioned in the joint declaration. So I think there's clarity here. Whether the administration has been dragging its feet, that I will not comment, but I think clearly it has its interest in finding a diplomatic solution, and I think the EU is also trying to do so.
Alexander, in Toulouse, the EU, these traditional negotiating bodies, NATO example, these institutions were formulated post-Cold War to try and freeze the tensions. To some extent, they have worked. But we're looking at a different landscape now, where there isn't actually a Cold War anymore. Are we moving towards a Cold War again, do you think?
Well, I think, you can't step in the same river twice. So whatever we're moving towards would be something very different. And of course, Cold War was two defining features. There were only two superpowers, and there was also very intense ideological um, standoff between them, capitalism against communism and so forth. So I think that's unlikely to be repeated. First of all, there will be much more centers of powers in the world, so China, Russia, Europe under American protection, possibly India, Iran, of course, and others. So it's not going to be a Cold War in a sense. There'll be just two blocks. There'll be more dispersed power structures in the world politics. Ideologically, again, there's something different in terms of great power nationalism and broadly great power rivalry. I would say kind of it's going back to pre-First World War scenario when you have several great powers kind of trying to battle each other. But yeah, nuclear weapons, of course, is the key. And I would say that if the Americans can't do Iran now, when they really desperate need more oil on the market, and Iran is the only kind of obvious place where all that extra oil will come when the Russian oil is banned. If they can't do it now, I don't see when they're going to do it ever again. And Iranians will eventually lose patience with it, and the consequences will be very, very grave. Both conflict with Israel, but also Saudi Arabia and so forth. It's all very, very dangerous stuff, and it's all very well to make a declaration with Israel that they will not allow. But how they're not going to allow? They're going to go to war with Israel, with Iran, to stop it. Is that really plausible in terms of American experience in Iraq and so forth? Iran is much.
Sorry, Alexander.
So
we are running out. We are running out of time, and I do want to come to everybody else. There is another way of dealing with this, and the Americans have actually done this to great effect in Pakistan by supporting Pakistan, by giving it money, by supporting its military. It's created a whole bunch of other problems in Pakistan, but it's kept the nuclear weapons in their silos. In Spain, Fabrice, do you think that's a good strategy?
I'm not sure, given Pakistan's track record in proliferation of some nuclear technology to other countries, including North Korea. So I think Pakistan was more a policy of fait accompli, where the US had no other choice but just to basically embrace Pakistan nuclear status and try to contain the issue and make sure that the right protocols were in place to avoid a miscalculation and regional conflict again vis-a-vis India. So I don't think there's a clear model here to follow. I think we have to think it in itself. But I do think that Iran has as much interest as the West to find a diplomatic solution. And like the previous speaker said, there's also obviously an energy oil supply dimension to it. But the midterms are obviously not going to help with the Republicans fiercely against whatever the Biden administration is trying to do on the diplomatic front on Iran.
Just very quickly, Sahil, in London, we're stumbling in the dark. Fabrice says that actually we need a new strategy, but we don't know what that strategy is. Is there anything that you think leads us out of this darkness? Is there a new strategy?
Absolutely. Dialogue on risk reduction and making sure that we deal with the fact that we have nuclear weapons. If you want to have nuclear weapons or you have them, you have to live with the responsibility and the consequences of them and explain to others how you will deal with the related challenges, right? So it's extremely important that all of the leaders of these key countries come together and are able to make sure that the correct scaffolding is in place so that we mitigate crises and that we mitigate conflict and war. So I think that the most important thing to do is to really have a deep reflection on how deterrence and arms control not only have always complemented one another, but that they always have had to complement one another to get us through really difficult periods like the Cold War. We don't want to get into another deep Cold War with Russia. We want to try to mitigate the risks and learn from the past mistakes that we've made so that we can ensure the safety and survivability of the entire world. And that's what is at stake, is really global peace and security, because nuclear weapons have the ability to annihilate the entire existence of this planet.
I want to thank all our guests, Sahil Shah, Fabrice Pothier and Alexander Titov. And I want to thank you as well for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here, bye for now.